so glad that you could join us for the closing panel of the Kaldor Centre's annual conference. My name is Linh, and I'm joining you today from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge any First Nations people joining us today as well. As someone who spent the last decade working in climate change and whose parents also came to Australia as refugees, this issue of migration, human mobility, and climate are actually quite personally and professionally intertwined. And I've been struck with the depth of conversation that's occurred over the last 3 days in relation to climate-related mobility, and what does that mean in the context of our work, whether we're coming at this from a legal perspective, a community perspective, one focused in on climate, or one more focused traditionally in on mobility. And I'm very much looking forward, as a bit of a climate tragic person, like at heart and in reality, to further discussing the critical importance of how we address migration and displacement issues in the face of the climate crisis. And with COP26, the UN climate change negotiations just around the corner, I couldn't think of a more timely and pertinent moment for us to be having this conversation. For our closing panel, we'll be looking at said climate negotiations in Glasgow, but also beyond as well. What does building support for people moving away from climate change actually look like? What will that require of us as individuals, us in the context of our work, or importantly, us in our demands of government? We'll be joined today by 4 experts from all around the world in a moderated discussion that I'll be leading. There'll also be an opportunity for you to ask questions though. Most of you will be very familiar with Zoom, but if you're not, there should be a button on your screen that says sort of Q&A. If you click on that, that's where you should be entering any questions that you have. You'll have an opportunity at the end, but if things pop up throughout, feel free to use that function. So without any further housekeeping, please let me introduce our speakers to you. So first up, we have Nisreen Elsaim, who is the chair of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change. She's also the chair of Sudan Youth Organization on Climate Change and is the general coordinator for the Youth and Environment Sudan platform. As you can see from some of the organizations that she works with, she's obviously got a real focus on young people, but as I recently learned, is also a physicist by background. Up next, we have Alex Randall joining us from the UK, where he is the Senior Program Lead of the Climate and Migration Coalition. For 15 years, he's had a focus on policy and advocacy on climate change, migration, and human rights issues at the local, national, and international level, so very relevant for us here today. He's had experience with the UNFCCC process, the Sustainable Development Goals, and also the Global Compacts for migration and refugees. We then have Koko joining us. She works at UN Climate Change, where she manages the vulnerability subdivision, which is focused on how do we scale up adaptation action. She's been previously a lead author on reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, otherwise known as the IPCC. We try to keep acronyms to a minimum, but sometimes they are easier. If any of your questions are to do with acronyms, we'll do our best to clarify. And she's previously also pioneered work on climate change and migration at the United Nations University. And last up, we have Martijn who is the founding partner of Pollination Group, a climate change advisory and investment firm seeking to accelerate the transition to net zero. Prior to this, he was the head of Baker McKenzie's global climate law and finance practice. He has played and continues to play a key role in Australia's clean energy finance institutions, but has extensive experience overseas as well. So I am sure that you're just hopefully as excited as I am about hearing from these 4 really sort of varied but deeply expert individuals around their thoughts on climate, mobility, and most importantly, what does that all mean in the context of COP26 and what we have to look forward to in the next couple of weeks. So over the last few days, you've all had the opportunity to listen from other experts, but I guess we'll start with centering things around COP26. I'd love to ask all of you, what do you see as being the most important thing people need to know when it comes to mobility in the face of climate, with Glasgow either in the front or the back of your mind? And why don't we start with you, Alex?
Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot. I think there are a couple of things that it's really key to keep in mind when we're thinking about climate-linked migration and displacement. And I'm just going to kind of mention a couple of them and then maybe say something quickly about COP as well. I think the first thing to to really understand is that it's key to grasp the actual dynamic of how climate change and mobility are connected, because if we don't understand that properly, then we are very likely to end up kind of moving towards the wrong kinds of policies, the wrong kinds of answers. And I think there are a couple of really key things. The first thing to understand, and I'm sure this has come up a lot over the last few days, is that right now and in the immediate future, most climate-linked movement is going to be internal. People are going to move within their own country. They're not going to cross international borders. And they're very likely to move the shortest distance possible available to them in order to find safety. That's the first thing to remember. The second thing that I think is really key to understand is that these new patterns of mobility are very likely not to be permanent. People are going to use migration as an adaptive strategy. They're going to use it as a livelihood strategy, and that may well involve moving, returning, moving with the seasons, moving as particular areas move in and out of crises. So what we're likely to see is firstly a pattern of internal mobility, and similarly a pattern of backwards and forwards, to and fro, circular and seasonal mobility. And that's very often at odds with what people kind of imagine climate-linked migration is going to be like, right? There's this idea that it's going to be across borders from one side of the world to another. So I think it's key to keep that in mind. I think then when we come to COP, the key thing to remember is that COP is one process where climate-linked mobility can be discussed and can be agreed upon between nations, but it's not the only one. So I think it's really important to understand what COP can and can't do, and to make sure our expectations and therefore our advocacy match the possibilities that can come out of COP. So I think the key thing that COP can do around mobility is around finance, and I think that's where that's the heart of the issue, right? The process at COP is geared up around dealing with emissions reduction and finance at its heart. And I think one key thing that we need to have in mind as we approach COP is how are states which are vulnerable to climate-linked mobility, how are they compensated? How is adaptation finance deployed to those countries to help them cope, help them deal with the fact that they are likely to have more people on the move within their own borders?
Excellent. Thanks for laying that groundwork for us, Alex. Over to you, Koko.
Yeah, thanks. And since climate negotiations are my day job, thank you so much, Alex. And I'm just going to compliment a few things that you said. Thank you so much again to the organizers for the chance to be with all of you. I think the central idea that I would like to share is that climate change is unfolding. One thing that we're trying to do in the climate negotiations over many, many years, this is a process, not an event. Please, you noticed that Alex said process. This is a process with a series of milestones. And it's really important in your advocacy and in your work to realize this is a process. I'll get to that in a minute. But I think one of the main ideas that we're grappling with, or that I would like to convey to you, is that climate change is reorganizing our planetary systems. We're driving anthropogenic climate change, hence the name. And part of this reorganization brings with it redistribution. And we know from history that migration and all kinds of movement are part of that redistribution. So we have a lot of lessons to learn from history. We have a lot of uncertainty looking forward. And for those of you who are scholars in this field, this is an incredibly exciting as well as concerning time. But climate change will redistribute. And this is really the time when we need to get prepared. So what is the purpose of international climate relations? Well, the foundation, the objective of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions, which drive changes in our atmosphere and all of these forces of redistribution that I just mentioned. So the purpose is to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere at a level that will prevent dangerous anthropogenic climate change. And what dangerous is, the IPCC has over these many years been providing greater and greater detail about the risks to humanity and to nature. But that's the point. And this is, again, an ongoing coordination process. So what do you expect at Glasgow? There are three major things that I'll mention. These dovetail again with what Alex said, but countries are coming together. It's been 5 years now since the Paris Agreement. Incredible moment when countries came together, agreed on a temperature range that they will aim for in that stabilization of greenhouse gas emissions. They also agreed to enhance efforts that will build resilience. I know that term means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but at the core of that is this idea that people will react, respond, adjust, and human mobility is part of that. That's been recognized now for at least a decade. So again, enhance ambition, both in mitigation as well as adaptation. One of the challenges with adaptation is the uncertainty. And that's where all of you come in. What do you know? What can you advise decision makers about what people are doing? What are sensible next steps and how to do that ambitiously and at scale? We're not talking about individual, important, but individual actions like switching from this or that. All of that is good. And we need a much larger scale of adjustment. So how do we enhance ambition and mitigation and adaptation? That's the first focus. The second,
that's really great,
is,
Koko. I might come back to you on focuses 2 and 3 in a moment, just so that we get some of the voices of our other panelists in as well. But I am curious to hear what they are and how they dovetail in with what Alex has shared. But maybe we'll go to you next, Martijn. I mean, we've already heard quite a lot about like the human mobility aspect of COP26, given some of the work that you do. Are there other issues that people need to be aware of that is coming up as part of this next milestone in, as Koko rightly noted, a process rather than just a singular event? You are on mute, unfortunately, which I think we were bound to have that happen at least once.
So I think what one hopes will come out of COP very much depends on the perspective at which you're looking at it. So I think, you know, it's been obviously a long time coming now because of COVID and having postponed the previous COP. I think at one level, there are probably a couple of things that are key that I think we see most people quite focused on. One is Article 6. How will Article 6 roll out under the negotiations, and will it be resolved? There's a big issue around carbon markets and trading carbon. And why that's important is because a lot of governments now, particularly developing country governments, are quite focused on how they can generate revenue from their natural capital assets to feed back into funding both climate mitigation and climate adaptation, and then through that also funding, in effect, things like relocating of communities, refugees, etc. So I think the whole issue of how do you use your natural capital assets and how do you use your other mitigation assets through Article 6 or Article 5 is particularly important. And there's been a lot of debate within the global community on this issue over the last 12 months, or actually the last 2 years. And so there's a focus on that. The second issue is how you actually, and will there ever be any transfer of funding from developed to developing countries? For many of the issues that we talk about, whether it's climate refugees, whether it's adaptation, whether it's nature-based solutions, whether it's technology transfer, it's been on the agenda for 30 years and nothing really happens. And that's a real challenge. And there's also a big issue, I think, which is coming out, which is a philosophical issue, which is that for many of the developing countries that have been very good actors on preserving their forests, for example, or their nature-based areas, if they were good actors under the existing UN rules and the Red Rules, they actually get penalised. If you're a bad actor who was threatened to remove forests, and you then you cease that activity and start to avoid that, you actually get rewarded. So there's a big momentum at the moment to try to readjust those incentives. And then I think finally, there's also just a more general focus about how people are really going to push through with reducing emissions overall in the mitigation front. And there's been a whole news article in the last couple of hours about a push behind the scenes to slow down the exit of fossil fuels. The investment community is pushing that very hard. But if we don't sort of move on that and we try to restrict that, then you'll start to see things splinter and we will never get to the targets that the Paris Agreement outlines.
Great, thanks for that, Martijn. I think too often the climate community has conversations that are either only about mitigation or only about adaptation, and it's really lovely to have all of our voices here that actually speak to why it's important to mitigate and what that has in terms of implications around adaptation. Nisreen, it'd be really great to hear from you in terms of your engagement with the process. What are some of the significant things that you're going to be focused on?
Yeah, I started the climate negotiation back in 2016. I started with gender and capacity building, and then moved to ACE, which is Action for Climate Empowerment, which is Article 12 in the Paris Agreement. And now since 2018, I'm focusing on technology transfer. So I just want to second everything that my previous colleagues mentioned. But a very important one to highlight is climate mobility or climate refugees or displacement is not really in the text of the agreements that we have right now. And it will be very hard to find funding instruments to things that are not documented in the technical text of the negotiations. And I think one of the biggest breakthroughs, because Alex mentioned that the COP is one process, but there are other processes. But for example, on the 8th of October, the Human Rights Council announced that now violation of environmental protection or environmental health or environmental right position in climate change and so on are violations to human rights. And I think this is a big breakthrough that we can actually highlight and we can actually refer to in the next processes. Looking forward to have a similar text or similar resolution from the Security Council, because for example, in my case in Sudan, this climate mobility or climate refugees or climate displacement is a great driver for conflicts. And I think it's all interlinked, as you and also my colleagues just mentioned. And regarding COP26, I mean, COP26 is a big milestone, because yes, in COPs, in terms of COPs, it's 5 years, but actually it's 6 years. We didn't have one last year, but the climate change did not stop with the COVID. Unfortunately, we cannot curfew climate change. So if we do not have COP last year, that doesn't mean that we take last year from our counting, because unfortunately we're still seeing the impact. We're still seeing the crises of climate change. And for the record, Sudan had its worst flood in 100 years, like a century, in 2020. So countries were extremely vulnerable, hit by economical crisis, hit by health crisis, which is the pandemic, and then again hit by climate crises. So it's really high time to have an actual direct link between everything happening. And for me, the key agenda item in COP26 will be loss and damage.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Nisreen. And also the reminder that climate change doesn't really stop for any one process, pandemic or otherwise. For those of you who are following along with the chat as well, Koko's just added in some extra context around Paris, migration and various adaptation work that you are welcome to take a look at. And I think she's sharing some links that you can read afterwards as well. I just want to pick up on a point that Nisreen mentioned then, where in many ways, mobility isn't really in the text for what is going to be discussed at COP26. And I guess given that, what can we expect in relation to human mobility in Glasgow in the form of commitments, either formally within the process or outside of it? Alex or Koko, I don't know if either of you would like to comment there.
I think I'll defer to Koko on this one.
Yeah, so the detailed answer we can talk about maybe in detail on a side conversation. What you want to watch for is you want to look at the agenda, and there are a whole bunch of agenda items. One of those is the report of the Warsaw International Mechanism Executive Committee. The issues right now dealing with human mobility, displacement is right now the word, but really they're looking at the full spectrum. All of those appear in the annual report of that committee. So as Nisreen just said, if you're interested in this issue, then you want to follow that discussion under the WIM XCOM. Those are discussions around loss and damage, and particularly look at that report. That will be the basis of negotiations. The three things that I mentioned, ambition, finance, and implementation, those are the other two, by the way, those are all very, very high level. So this particular issue is couched within ambition, for example, a little bit of finance, and of course implementation, but it's not one of the top issues. So look at the XCOM report. I'll put the link in the chat box.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that link. I'm sure people will be interested in where they can do that further reading and how to follow along with COP26 when this hasn't been really a part of the mainstream media coverage. What are the other key words to be looking out for if this is an area that you're interested in? So maybe picking up on the fact that it isn't a formal part of the text, at least not for the untrained eye. Something that you mentioned, Alex, is that this is only one of many other international processes. Given your experience in a fair few areas, where do you see the greatest opportunity to, I guess, further progress the conversation around mobility and climate and work towards outcome?
Right. So I think there are a couple of key places. The first one is the Platform on Disaster Displacement, which is a state-led process creating a voluntary agreement on the rights of people who are displaced across international borders in the context of climate change. And that's really key because it's specifically focused on the connection between climate disasters and displacement. It is a voluntary agreement and a voluntary process, but actually one of the things that I think has been really heartening from that process is the willingness of a lot of states to engage with it. So I think that's really important. I think the other thing to remember, though, is that it's probably a mistake to approach this imagining that there is one process or one event or one international agreement which just fixes this issue, right? For a long time, that was very much the way the debate was framed, you know. It was suggested that we needed a completely new international agreement, or that the Refugee Convention could be updated, or that some other piece of kind of international, you know, process could be used to create the kind of protection that people need. The reality is that we're probably going to end up with a bit of a jigsaw, right? There will be, you know, the COP process, which is important, and will create some of the solution. We've got Platform on Disaster Displacement. There's potentially ways that the Sustainable Development Goals can be used to address this as well. The Compact on Refugees and Migration. All of these things mention climate change, mention mobility, and they can be kind of pieced together to create the answer that we need. But the other key thing is that if we remember that so much of this movement is going to be internal, that means that actually it isn't always a matter of international agreement or international processes. It's a matter of domestic law or domestic policy that governments may well often be creating and then managing outside of an international process. It will be a matter for their civil servants, for their parliaments, for their domestic processes to address this. And I think that's a really neglected area, is exploration of how governments are dealing with this internally as a domestic issue, as well as focusing on the international processes.
Excellent. Thanks for that reminder and contextualization. Koko, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, just Alex, actually the whole panel, everything that you're saying is so good and inspiring. That focus on national legislation and helping countries in particular, because that's where all of this actually happens, helping raise awareness, figure out what to do next, get prepared. Now is that time. In your research, your advocacy, one thing that is quite a challenge is we have what we have, institutions, laws, frameworks. Those were built to address 20th century challenges, incredibly important. So much to learn. And yet the challenges that we face now in the 21st century have distinct characteristics. And I think that's one of the really exciting contributions that this community has to make. And of course, it's really important to build and bring in new thoughts. The 20th century and human mobility will challenge current institutions. So really just seconding what Alex has said. There's a lot of work to do, and now's a great time to do that work.
Excellent. I think all of us here have engaged in the UNFCCC process, amongst others, for a number of years, and I feel some innovation and disruption wouldn't go awry at all. But just coming back to the point that Alex raised around how there's not going to be necessarily any one new process that everything will get resolved at, and it'll end up being a bit of a jigsaw, and we're going to require some level of domestic action as well. I guess, Martijn, for many of our audience here who are Australian, how do you think some of this either intersects with our own current migration and sort of refugee policies, and is there some opportunity there for how we address this issue domestically here?
I think there is, but before I get to that, I just want to come back to a point that was raised by Alex. So one of the problems here, the fundamental problem we have, and I don't want to be sort of put it down on this, but no one really cares when it comes to it, right? So at the end of the day, when we're talking about issues of how do you deal with mitigation adaptation, how do you deal with refugees, all of the promises that are made are largely hollow. So we worked on Fiji's for many years on their COP as advisors on the COP presidency. As part of that process, we set up a fund called the Fiji's Climate Relocation Displaced Peoples Trust Fund. That was a fund that was really the world's first fund ever to put money into relocating communities. There'd already been 2 communities relocated prior to in 2017 due to sea level rise. And this fund was really meant to be a world first to get money into reallocating communities and really to do it under domestic law. There's been about 42 communities that have asked for government support to move as sea level rise and salination happens. And despite launching that at COP and many promises and many people saying they would like to, to contribute to that, the only country that actually contributed initially was New Zealand at $2 million, right? So this is a minor, and that was part of a much bigger package. And at least New Zealand has been contributing significant funding to the Pacific for the purpose of doing that. And so we have a country interesting like Fiji, which has some really innovative domestic law. They've just passed a Climate Change Act. They had prior to that what was called an ECAL, and an Environmental Climate Change Adaptation Levy, where 10% of high-end tourism would go into that fund. That was a highly successful fund. 10%, it raised about $150 million a year, could be put towards climate adaptation, but obviously with COVID and the destruction of tourism, the country's now some $8 billion in debt. And unless you get rid of that debt, it's a very hard thing to find money, so it becomes entirely reliant upon aid. So I think for Australia, for the government, who is surrounded by many of these communities where they're low-lying Pacific islands and where issues of climate refugees and sea level rise are absolutely critical, the government needs to be doing far more in the Pacific. For example, to be helping governments like Fiji and others deal with this issue. I think in Australia, we have our own issues in the Torres Strait Islands, where a number of islands there are often flooded and become for periods uninhabitable. We have areas of Australia which will become uninhabitable and there will be migration, but there's no real sort of comprehensive plan or thinking around that. We're too busy at the moment fighting about whether we should even commit to a target, let alone how we should be dealing with climate change properly. So I think one of the other challenges in Australia is that even when there is what I would call, impacts of adaptation up on the north coast of New South Wales around Byron Bay, we've had a lot of coastal erosion, a lot of houses going into the sea. And quite often you end up in a position where the government says it's just easier to hand out money. So no one will insure it, nothing will be done. There's no plan. It's just a matter of the government says, oh, well, the politics of this look bad. We don't associate sea level, we don't associate storm damage with eroding coastlines. We just see it as just natural rather than climate change. So we'll just write a check and be done with it. So these are, we have to first of all acknowledge that climate's a real issue, and we have to find new mechanisms to get money flowing and aid flowing to our neighbours who desperately are trying to deal with this issue.
I think that's a really good point. And sometimes it's not our neighbours, but actually Australian citizens. 350 Australia is running a really great campaign supporting Torres Strait communities that, if our audience haven't checked out yet, it's called Our Islands, Our Home. That's something that's really worth throwing your weight behind and supporting what does, internal displacement when it comes to climate change looks like, even on the shores of Australia. That's a really interesting point around like the Fiji example that you gave and how it, at that international level didn't necessarily get the support that was required. I'd love to hear from our other panelists if there are other, I guess, interesting or slightly unusual from just these international processes that you've seen in terms of how countries or like other types of organizations are responding to this challenge of migration and climate, that is. Maybe Nisreen, I don't know if you have an example that you'd like to share with us.
Yep. So I kind of agree and disagree with the previous statement of Alex that it's mostly going to be domestic migration. It might be in countries that have space actually, and the countries that are actually landlocked or a landmass, but most of the coastal areas or the coastal cities or the coastal islands, for example, Sri Lanka, for example, Bangladesh will lose like a third of its land because of the rise of the sea level, and I don't think the rest of Sri Lankan land can actually, Bangladesh land can actually hold the rest of the population. In Sudan, on another hand, Sudan is a big country with a modest population comparing to the land we have, but third of Sudan is currently a desert. So even this land or this mass land is completely useless for a community that's actually nature-based agriculture or pastoral communities. We made a survey in Sudan in 2018, and 80% said they will cross the Mediterranean to Europe illegally, even if they know that there is 90% chance of dying in the Mediterranean and not reaching Europe. And for me, these 80% have a suicidal actually behavior, because if you know that there is a 90% chance that you will not succeed and you will not be able to cross the Mediterranean, and yet you will do it, this is suicidal. And when we ask them, but then why are you going to take this chance and this risk? Even 90% is a big chance that you will not make it there. And they said, we are dead anyway. If we are here and we cannot have water, we cannot have grasses for our cattle, we cannot have way of living, and also if we are crossing and if we did not have any ways of supporting our lives, then we are dead. And if we cross the Mediterranean, then we are also dead. So at least we are trying, we're not staying in one place. Luckily, this percentage dropped in 2019, but not significantly. And I think when it comes to climate change and when it comes to communities like our communities, it's a matter of really alive or dead, and it's really a matter of not only that, but it's a matter of dignity for them, because these people used to carry themselves, they used to have food from themselves. They don't want to depend on humanitarian aid, because we already have many camps in Sudan because of the situation in South Sudan, the situation in Ethiopia, the situation in Eritrea, the situation in all of the surrounding countries, and the situation in Sudan itself, since we had more than 20 years of civil war in the western states. So they don't want to have this life, and they will not stop, they will not stay in one place, they must move, because humans are survival creatures. So yeah, it will kind of be domestic until a certain extent, but it will always return to the natural thing, which is the international one, and it will mostly be Europe also, especially for the African continent.
Thanks for sharing that, Nisreen, and being willing to disagree with what other panelists are saying. I think that's what makes for lively discussion, but also a really important reminder of the word here, that it's not just migration, but it's forced migration, and it's forced migration due to climate change. And when it does become a matter of life or death, and certainly about dignity, these are important things, even though it might feel for some who maybe are newer to this, a little bit more abstracted, to be reminded of the reality of the individuals that might be facing this. Now, Alex, rather than directly replying to Nisreen, I know that the Climate and Migration Coalition recently released a report about the role of refugee and migrant-led organisations, and I'd love to hear, I guess, what type of innovation or different type of perspective that might offer us in the challenge.
Yeah, so we conducted some interview research with migrant and refugee-led organisations, and really what we wanted to try and understand was the barriers and the driving forces that mean that some refugee and migrant-led organisations are engaged in the debate about climate change and are kind of creating and developing their own kind of climate change projects, but also the reasons why sometimes they're not. And we interviewed 12 organizations from across the world to try and kind of tease these ideas out. And the conclusions were really interesting. And what we found was that so we were speaking to organizations that, you know, refugee and migrant organizations that are doing, you know, the kind of pioneers that are doing climate change work. And the results were fascinating. And what we found was that for organizations in the global north from kind of wealthier countries, their motivation was that they saw themselves as part of a long history of the protection of migrant and refugee rights. They saw their organizations as part of a movement stretching back into the 20th century to the kind of aftermath of the Second World War. And what they saw, and the kind of motivating force for then kind of starting climate change projects, was that they saw climate change essentially as the latest and biggest threat to those hard-won gains that they had worked for over the last decades. What we found in the answers from the organizations in the global south was quite different, and their motivation, the driving force often behind their climate change projects, was a feeling that you couldn't separate these issues out, right? That for them and their organizations and the people that they were working directly with, climate change and mobility, the environment and people moving, disasters and displacement just weren't separate issues in the way that they maybe are for Western organizations or organizations in the global north, where it's very easy, and I say this as, you know, someone from a northern country who kind of deals with these issues quite theoretically. It's maybe easier for me to kind of detach these things from each other and say, oh, this is a climate change issue, this is a migration issue, and theoretically, because I'm not dealing directly with them myself, to kind of see them as completely different things. But for the organizations in the south that were dealing kind of very directly with the impacts of climate change, their reason for working at that nexus between climate change and migration was simply that these were not different issues.
Can I just jump in for 1 sec? I think the issues are connected, but I just don't think the connection's always made. So if you take what's happening with water, nature, and climate, right? So you take water, what's happening in California, you take sea level rise, what's happening in Florida, you take what's happening in Cape Town with respect to water, you take what's happening in many countries around the world that are actually running out of water. Those cities will become, within the next few years, uninhabitable, right? It's happening quickly. I think people just are not seeing how fast things are coming and how things are changing that quickly. So I think, what's really interesting about this is that, it's all tied together, as you say, Alex, and even when you're talking about one of the key reasons to protect forests and rainforests around the world, apart from the climate angle, is because they are the homes of many of the world's indigenous communities. And you need to basically protect those forests, and that then ties you in. And then also, if you destroy these rainforests in many parts of the world, that destroys global agriculture because the rainfall patterns are destroyed. So to me, it's a lot of the connectivity between these issues that is often misunderstood and is not being put together. And people, you're right, people do see them as disconnected, but I don't think they see the bigger picture. And I think that is where some of these ecosystem changes are going to simply break down, and we're going to face fundamental challenges that we're going to have to deal with.
I think that's very true. Just a reminder to our audience that after my one more question, I'll be throwing over to you. So feel free to ask your questions. Koko's been doing a stellar job answering some of them already, but we'll also try to answer some of them live as well. So the last question that I have, well, not really the last, the last for now, and welcome any of you to chime in, is just, I guess, building on what Martijn just said there, is that so we here know that these issues are interconnected and interconnected with many other sort of social, environmental, and economic issues as well. But how do we help other people that don't yet see those connections or don't yet see that bigger picture? Like, what's the narrative change that is needed, and how could we be pushing that forward? Or if you have suggestions of like better practices for our audience, I'd really love to hear, because I think that's a very tangible thing that people would love to walk away from today with.
Yeah, I can jump on this. So I think we can learn from the journey of climate change acknowledgement itself. First of all, we had hundreds of climate denials, and actually thousands, hundreds of thousands. And some believers invested in research and in scientific evidence. Now we have more research outside about climate change, and we have also more people speaking about climate change, and automatically more people started to believe in climate change, not only because of the science, but also because we clearly see the impacts of it. So I think the first step also to speak about mobility or displacement and its relationship regarding climate change and the drivers for that is to invest in science and research, first of all, and secondly, to speak more about it. There are windows opening regarding displacement and climate change, or human mobilities and climate change, or migration and climate change. Yet I don't think these windows are enough to make a propaganda, let me say, and to make it very obvious on their faces that climate change is happening, and it's causing mobility, it's causing displacement, it's causing migration, and it's happening whether you like it or not, because we have this evidence, we have this evidence, and we have this evidence. So investing in science and talking more and more about this interlinks and about this combination and about this relationship between the two events is really key and really assets. Also, like networking, because now Alex just answered the question of the work of the migration networks in the south and in the north, and I think there is a big community that actually cares about this issue, but they don't have this proper communication among themselves. So networking is also a great step and a great way of doing it. My last recommendation will also be to some sort of using media, because media, not only the traditional but also social media, is a very great tool and a very great way to reach more people, and more people understanding the issue and the connection between the different topics and this interlinkage, more believers we had and more actions oriented discussions we will have. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks for those tangible answers. And I think, Koko, I saw you maybe almost come off mute there. Would you like to share something?
Yeah, and then I just got so entranced with what you were saying, Nisreen. That's good. We've been thinking a lot about climate change, and you'll see all kinds of different approaches in the media, for example. Alarmism to it's bad, but wait, it doesn't have to be bad, to everything's going to be fine, we have this solution, whatever. I've been thinking a lot, and in fact, I just grabbed a bunch of books right here, many books, about what causes collective behavioral change. And certainly people moving is a collective behavior. People, of course, often gravitate towards where their cousin has gone or where diaspora communities are. So I think the more that we can understand about the dynamics of complex collective behaviors, the more effective as a community we will be in helping institutions prepare, people prepare, and see their options. So I've put a few thoughts in the margins about what's needed, and my sense is it's a bit of a rethink. It's thinking, well, what is the desired thing? Who would do that desired thing? Who would the audience be? Talk to that audience. Don't talk to everybody, but talk to that target audience and understand what do they need and what can be helpful. Use measurement and analytics to see if things are changing. Create compelling messages for that target audience. That's all actually very far away from migration and climate change research, but actually probably needs to be a greater part of what we're doing together to keep people safe, to make sure that people have what they need to adjust to the climate impacts that are around them. That may include human mobility. It may include other things, but I think we need to rethink about how we think about impacts, talk about them, and measure them.
Excellent.
When it comes to human behavior.
It sounds like there's quite a lot of interdisciplinarity there that could definitely be explored both by academics, but also practitioners as well. And it sort of dovetails almost nicely into an audience question that we have, which is, are the voices of the actual affected communities, whether they're in the global north, within certain countries, but more specifically within the global south, actually being heard in this conversation at the moment? And if not, how do we amplify them? What is the role of all of us who's attending this conference right now? Maybe Alex, I think you were about to come off mute just then. So I'm going to throw this question to you first.
I'd say broadly, if you look at this debate in the global north and you look at what's being said by actors in the global north or the west or whatever we want to call it, developed countries, yeah, the voices of affected communities are really not part of that debate. And I sort of feel acutely conscious of myself, my own position here as someone who grew up in a northern country, as a white guy talking about this issue. But yeah, it's true. The voices of those communities are not particularly part of this discussion. And I think the risk of that, I mean, firstly, it's an ethical problem. Like, how is this debate unfolding without the presence of those communities and those voices? That's like, simply kind of not how this should be playing out. But also, the solutions to these issues are usually hyperlocal, right? Like, you can't just kind of come up with an answer and apply it universally across the world to every single place where climate change and mobility are connected. So there's really no way that the right solutions, the right answers, the correct policies, whatever level we're working at, there's really no way that those answers can be reached without the experiences, the voices, context that comes from the people who are directly impacted by climate change, from the experiences of people who are already on the move because of climate change. And that is a huge problem.
Excellent. Martijn, before you go, audience, please ask more questions. Otherwise, I'll be providing my own questions, and that would be great for me, but maybe not for you. Martijn, you were going to say?
In my view, there's a two-track process going on, right? So there's the process going on between governments and at the UN level, etc., which is talking about policy. And with all due respect to everybody, it is not really changing things that much. When you add up the NDCs and action on the ground, it's well behind where we need to get to. And at the rate we're going to hit 3%, 3.5% by 2050. So we're not going to get there. The second track is actually what is happening, and it is quite exciting, which is that at a global investment community, things are moving incredibly fast, much faster than governments. And in Australia, the investment community is well ahead of governments in terms of what they want to do. So the decision has been made in most developed and developing countries to exit coal. There are a few countries that are still looking at that, but on the whole, that is where the money has gone. There will be no more, in the next few years, there'll be no more investment for any new coal. Similar things happening on oil and gas. The IEA is saying a similar thing. There's a huge amount of money going into renewable energy, and a lot of that is happening in developing countries. A huge amounts of focus on renewables in countries like Morocco, Indonesia, a lot in Latin America. Those fundamental changes will ultimately drive a shift in the global economy, and they will ultimately mean there'll be less emissions. And this shift is driven by a couple of things. One, by investors wanting more disclosure, which we've seen around the Task Force Financial Disclosure. We're now seeing a significant focus on nature with a task force on nature risk. And, you know, you need to also then start to applying that to people risk and mitigation risk. But at the moment, we've gone from investor risk. The next thing is nature risk. We've now got to think a lot more about human risk, which we're not thinking, and also human health, which is a forgotten part of the climate debate. So in my mind, things are moving so fast on the investment side and the technology side, that there is real hope there. And I think that while the UN process sort of stumbles along, and it will stumble along, the real activity is coming at that, probably more so in the last 6 months than any other time in that space. And I think that is sort of cause for optimism.
Koko, thank you, Martijn.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Martijn. I agree with you, and I politely disagree, since we're in this world of diplomacy. I'd encourage all of us to think of not either or, but, you know, working together. And you're absolutely right. We've been doing this climate negotiations thing for 30 years, which seems like it's probably more than some of you have even lived. And yet it's a joint effort and one of coordination. And it's just so helpful to hear from different sectors. Wonderful comments that you just said, Martijn, about what's needed, what needs to be unlocked. You emphasized a lot of things that need to happen around COP26 to unlock market potentials, for example. So for the audience, I hope that you can see broadly the point of international coordination is exactly that. It doesn't always happen very smoothly, and it's so encouraging, Martijn, to hear you also speaking of some things that are happening anyway in the world at a very quick pace. We all need that energy to keep, not to give up, because tomorrow's another day and it is not the last moment for humanity. We will keep working as long as we're breathing.
Excellent, thank you. Part of me is disappointed we've only had 2 on-air disagreements so far, but I think there has been like a fair amount of consensus around what we've been hearing from our panelists, certainly around the need for these issues that are sometimes talked about as being separate or sometimes siloed into, well, you're the migration expert, you're the climate person, stick in your lane. I think people are very, for whatever reason, unfortunately, good at being territorial. Given that, I guess I'd love each of you to close off with, what is it that we could be doing better then, particularly from your perspective? There might be people in the audience that, you know, are from the investor community, are from a global north or a global south organization, may already be an expert and actively working on this or not. What do we need to take away and do differently in order to actually have these issues be much more interconnected in how we both talk and work on it, and not just this, it's either going to happen domestically or globally, but again, interlinking the two. So I'm going to go with, I'm sorry, alphabetical order. Alex, I saw you look away, but alphabetical order it is.
So I think the key emerging issue, as I see it, at this nexus of climate change and migration is about the rise of the border industries and the border security industry, which is looking at this as a new opportunity for profit. And I find that extremely worrying indeed. So for me, that's the key worry and the key thing that needs to be challenged. What we've seen over the last few years as the issue of climate change and mobility has gained traction in the media. The businesses, the industries that run for-profit border detention centers, for-profit border surveillance, the tech and AI industries that conduct remote surveillance at borders have swooped into this space and are looking at the potential of cross-border mobility and governments' desire, primarily northern governments' desire, to prevent that mobility as an opportunity for profit. And that obviously to me feels like absolutely the wrong solution. We should be opening borders, allowing people to move, creating safe legal routes for people to move from one country to another. But unfortunately, there is a huge amount of money, huge amount of investment stacked around preventing people crossing those borders. And to me, our next task is challenging that apparatus, challenging that border industrial complex.
It sounds a little bit like the prison industrial complex. So there's a few
exactly
parallels there, aren't there? I feel like that is a whole separate conversation that I'm very keen to have afterwards. But Koko, you are next up in my alphabetical order list.
Wow, that's this has all been so compelling, and I'm taking inspiration from all three of you as panelists, and such nice questions, Lynn. For me, I think what we need is imagination about what's going to be needed in the future. So Martijn, for example, emphasized, as well as Alex and Nisreen, we're in interconnected systems. Welcome to the 21st century. There's so many things now that are more deeply interconnected than we realized before. We need scenarios based on what people need. If you take a country like where I'm from, you know where I'm from. I'm from the US. Things that affect people moving, let's say in the pandemic where we can work virtually, aren't things necessarily studied in this particular community. You're looking at municipal bonds, real estate, zoning, just to name three. We need scenarios about what people need, jobs as well, taxes, etc. All of the things that make a place habitable and safe, including climatic conditions. We need scenarios and broad-based conversations that aren't so much focused on a lot of conversations now are focused on, maybe a lot of people will be coming to where you live, and that maybe is quite uncomfortable given how politicized these issues are. I think we need to focus on what do people need, and some scenarios that involve all of these different stakeholders to unlock imagination about what needs to be done now and sequenced over the coming couple of years. I think that would be very helpful.
That's a great reminder, and I quite like your framing that we're using 20th century institutions to solve 21st century challenges, that if we go at a very glacial pace, we may as well be thinking about what is possible in the 22nd century and what should we be aiming for there. So Martijn, you are next.
So I'm just going to answer one of the questions at the same time in my response, which was from Brian, who asked, who are the investors and what is happening? So let me just give you a couple of examples. So over the last 6 months, we've had many institutions come out with very large financial commitments to invest in technologies and transformations that will help address climate change. So the Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund, Temasek, along with BlackRock, one of the biggest asset managers in the world, has recently committed $1 billion towards a decarbonisation effort. TPG with RISE, which is largely headed by the former US Treasury Secretary, Frank Paulson, has come out with a $7 billion target, of which they've already raised $4.5 billion towards investing in this space. Brookfield have just announced a $12.5 billion investment target towards putting money in this space. General Atlantic, another $4 billion. The business that we're involved in has done joint venture with HSBC, targeting $6 billion for nature and Indigenous communities. So there are a lot of people at the moment that are trying to, and Tom Steyer, again in the US, has just announced a very major fund to look at this. So we're seeing a wall of capital come. The challenge with this wall of capital is threefold. One, they cannot find things to invest in. Number two, on the adaptation front, adaptation doesn't pay. And on the nature front, nature doesn't pay. So what we need to do is to make sure that when that money is invested, it does so in a way that not only helps address climate change, but it meets multiple objectives. So whether that's dealing with migration, adaptation, nature-based solutions, that the capital that is being allocated is educated as to how to direct that money to make the best outcome for the planet. Another example of that is Bezos with his Amazon fund, $1 billion pledged, and a lot more coming. So we need to make sure that these billionaires who want to allocate money to the planet actually allocate it in the right way, spend it in the right way, get outcomes in the right way, and are actually held accountable for the commitments they make. It's very easy to make these global commitments of capital, but unless we hold them to account, the money doesn't flow properly, is my experience.
I think that's a really great reminder. And today, Mike Cannon-Brookes, another one of Australia's billionaires, just pledged $1.5 billion to additional projects. And yeah, I think there's a fair amount to be followed up on there. Nisreen, lucky last, over to you.
Thank you. Okay, so I will wear the government hat. I've never worked for the government, but I know what governments are actually facing. Well, I wish if opening the borders is as easy as it sounds right now, because in Sudan we are host for more than, I think the numbers are talking about 4 to 3 million refugees and also IDPs from inside, but in different communities, and this actually have a great pressure on the economy, on the natural resources, on the services distribution, and on everything, literally, because I mean, the idea of borders as it was before is, I know that these are my people, so as government, I'm responsible to provide services for them, okay? And in many cases, in many cases, these governments, especially developing countries or the least developed countries, doesn't provide enough services to their people in the first place, and not mentioning also hosting other refugees from other countries. And if we really want an Zitobian world where we can open borders, then we should also do that with resource, with wealth, with GDPs, with everything, and with services, education quality. I mean, we have to have equality in everything before we can actually open the borders. Because as a refugee, for example, or as a migrant or as a displaced person, I will rather go to a better place than go to a lower income country that doesn't even have enough to feed their people. Yet sometimes it's the only option to come to such a country, for example, Sudan. And not mentioning that these governments are already impacted by the climate change issues, because in Sudan, for example, again, 70% of our our resources and our outcomes are agricultural or pastoral based, which is already a sensitive income, climate sensitive incomes. So there's a lot of pressures on the developing countries or the least developing countries government itself, and to solve this problem we really need to have that equal world, that everything is equal. And I don't think the world leaders are ready yet, especially the developed countries one, to do this. Thank you very and also this takes us to the colonialism, this takes us to the equity of wealth sharing, and there's a lot of things that all interlinked together, because before we can actually put in table such a bold idea as open borders between different countries. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nisreen. I feel like in our closing panel, we have generated enough future potential topic areas that the Kaldor conference has the follow-up very much well planned already. I just want to thank our panelists for really sharing your perspectives, being willing to disagree, being very generous with your perspectives about what it is that we could be doing. You all offered really profound and I think great insight around what we could be taking away as an audience. So thank you very much. But as this is the closing panel, I'd like to pass over to Jane McAdam.
Thanks very much, Lynn, and thanks to all our panelists for such a spectacular closing event. I really think that was a wonderful way to cap off what has been a really successful virtual conference. So my thanks to all of you, and of course to all the speakers and chairs for the other sessions, and the audience. Without you, of course, we'd really just be talking to ourselves. So thank you for your participation. It's been terrific. And we've had a lot of engagement too with the videos that are already up on the conference website. I'd particularly like to thank our sponsors for the conference too. Our premier sponsor, UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, as well as law firms Slater and Gordon, Hall and Wilcox, Norton Rose Fulbright, Varese, and Watton and Kearney for their sponsorship. And it's extraordinary to have so many of you, as I said, joining us and being part of this and many other of our events. We're so grateful for you across the world to be with us to discuss issues as important as this one. I'd also like to express my gratitude to the Faculty of Law and Justice at the University of New South Wales, which has provided enormous support as well, and to members of the Kaldor Centre, without whom this really couldn't have happened. I'd like to acknowledge in particular our interns, Sam Pride and Akriti Shori, for their help with this event, And the core team behind the scenes, Lauren Martin, Frances Voon, and special thanks to Frances Nolan, who has really been there in the background with all the sessions, prepping the speakers beforehand, doing tech checks. It's been a tremendous group effort, so thank you very much. I think this conference has showcased the challenges of mobility in the context of climate change and disasters, as well as the opportunities that are there to be seized. As has been stressed throughout, this is not just an issue of the future, but an issue of the here and now. We have heard from a diverse range of experts from affected communities, international organisations, government, civil society, and academia, but all are united in a common purpose. That is to ensure that those affected by the impacts of climate change and disasters can retain their agency, their dignity, and the ability to stay in their homes when they wish, but to have options to move out of harm's way. With COP26 next month, we hope that our conference has contributed to the global call to action on climate change and climate justice. The Kaldor Centre will continue to work on climate change, disasters and mobility as a priority area for both our research and engagement into the future. And we hope that you'll join us on our mission. I therefore invite you to keep in touch with us by joining our mailing list and following us on social media. We look forward to seeing you at another event in the future, hopefully in person. Thank you very much.